Hello there, I'm Noel Hacegaba, Chief Operating Officer at the Port of Long Beach. Welcome to Supply Chain Insight, where we explore the latest trends, issues, and news in the supply chain with top industry leaders, experts, and influencers. Our objective is to bring you the insight you need to help you keep your cargo moving. Today's business executives expect a lot from their supply chains: efficiency, velocity, flexibility, cost management, and operational excellence. Supply Chain Insight brings the supply chain to you, one segment at a time, to explore new approaches and innovative solutions that will help you and the Port of Long Beach deliver greater value to our customers and partners. In today's episode, we will hear from one of the industry's most widely recognized economists, Paul Bingham. Paul is the Director for Global Intelligence and Analytics Transportation Consulting for S&P Global Market Intelligence. In this role, Paul leads business advisory services product teams, analyzes and forecasts freight transportation demand and infrastructure requirements, and drives business innovation. Paul primarily focuses on North American freight transportation markets, including the international trade of North America. He manages multimodal freight transportation market analysis and forecasting for public and private sector clients. Paul rejoined the company in 2019 after having worked at predecessor economic forecasting firms Global Insight, Standard & Poor's Data Resources Incorporated, and Wharton Econometric Forecasting Associates. Earlier, he led the national economics practice of engineering planning firm CDM Smith and worked in the transportation consulting practices of Booz Allen Hamilton and ICF. Paul serves 3 terms as an appointed member of the U.S. Federal Advisory Committee on Supply Chain Competitiveness and is a former chair of the U.S. National Academies of Science Transportation and Research Board, Freight Systems Group. Paul is a member of the Council on Supply Chain Management Professionals, where he contributes to their annual State of Logistics and EPIC country supply chain risk reports. Paul, welcome to Supply Chain Insights.
Thank you.
We are thrilled to have you for our year-end cargo update and market outlook for 2024. In fact, we're going to be titling this episode, What's in Store for 24 and More. So in my view, you are exactly the right person to have on for this episode.
Oh, this is perfect to end the year to talk about what's going to happen in 2024.
Fantastic. Well, let's jump right into the questions. Paul, 2023 for us here in Long Beach has been a return to pre-pandemic levels. In fact, we're on track to end the calendar year right on track of 2019, if not a bit higher. What is your assessment of 2023, especially in the backdrop of 2022 and 2021?
Well, this has been a year of a more normalization of conditions. Obviously, we're past the peak of the pandemic consumer spending. It lingered into this year a little bit. But we've seen this year, finally, we're back to 2019 seasonality patterns. Inflation has come down. Some of the other indicators that we look at for the health of the economy and the health of trade have been trending in the right direction this year. We've achieved labor peace, which was a big question as we headed into the beginning of the year. And we have conditions coming out at the end of the year that's not a really strong economy overall, but is still one where consumers are spending and trade is rebounding, as you've pointed out.
You know, Paul, is there anything about 2023 that has surprised you?
Well, there have been a whole number of disruptions to the supply chain system, mostly outside the country, though we've got one right now going on at the Texas-Mexico border with some rail crossings. For supply chain managers, continued surprises, not perhaps to the magnitude that we saw with the pandemic, but disruptions in Panama or the Suez Canal, the Hamas attacks against Israel and the war that's followed from that, all were not something that we could have anticipated a year ago and clearly have some potential to affect supply chains.
And of course, all these global events have a domino effect across the supply chain. And of course, it's hard enough to plan for the expected, harder still to plan for the unexpected. So speaking of some of these shocks or surprises, you know, we're well past the supply chain crisis and related disruptions. But just this year, the Panama Canal Authority had to restrict capacity due to water shortages stemming from a historic drought. How long do you see this continuing, and how do you think this will affect the global supply chain?
Well, the Panamanians face a real obstacle. They've got a freshwater system. They're dependent on rainfall. And so if climate change and conditions, severe weather lead to inadequate rainfall, they're in a position where there's not a whole lot they can do about it in the short run, and consequently that's affected the capacity they have to offer for global shipping. And even though they've recently had some rainfall, we've seen that the transit numbers they're projecting on into the beginning of the year are still going to be down from about a third from what they normally would be if they had sufficient rainwater. That's a big problem in terms of total capacity of what you can move through the canal system. And there's no getting around that. That affects the U.S. The biggest country customer of the Panama Canal has been and continues to be the United States. It's U.S. trade that's primarily affected by that low water situation. And there's no easy solution. The Panamanians have engineering planning to try to expand the watershed, to take some other actions to try to manage the water that they use in the lock system better. But ultimately, it's a severe challenge in the long run on a system that's based on fresh water and rainfall. And for shippers using the Panama Canal, the alternative to that is the West Coast ports, if you're on Trans-Pacific trade, or going all the way down around the Cape and the extra time and expense and emissions that are associated with that.
In fact, one of the common questions we're getting today is what effect the restrictions that the Panama Canal Authority are having here on the West Coast. And speaking just for the Port of Long Beach, we have seen an uptick in recent months. We expect for that uptick to continue. And we think a good chunk of that is a result of what's happening there in Panama.
Yeah, there's no question that shipping managers have seen the reactions of the steamship lines. Even though container ships get priority to transit the canal with a reservation system, they've had to light load. They can't sail through fully loaded, which affects the operating efficiency and obviously the costs for that, and the dependability. You know, can they be assured that there won't be a delay when they get to the canal? That's an issue. And the alternative of the Suez route, I'm sure we'll talk about too. But the Panamanian problem is one that's not solvable by a naval task force. There's no easy, quick solution, which then means supply chain managers have to think about what are the alternatives to using that route for cargo.
Yeah. Well, you alluded to this. This brings us to the next question, Paul. More recently, major shipping lines announced that they're bypassing the Suez Canal in response to the safety risks posed at the Red Sea. How do you see that situation unfolding and impacting the global supply chain?
Well, from a global perspective, in some ways, it's a bigger issue for global trade because the Europeans depend on the Suez Canal much more than the U.S. does for trade with the Indian subcontinent and parts of Asia. That problem may be resolved a little bit more quickly with this new naval task force, but I'm not so sure how quickly that will happen. The vessels that have been diverted, that's at least 7 to 10 days or more, depending upon the actual routing and where they were when they were rerouted around Cape of Good Hope. There's issues with war risk insurance that even if you were able to have your vessel transit now, the cost of that, in addition to the Suez Canal tolls to have to pay the insurance cost of being essentially in a war zone, as opposed to alternative routes, increase the cost to those carriers. And there's the reluctance on the part of some of the steamship lines to expose their crews or their ships to potential military threats, which really they can't defend against. And there's only so much a Navy can do for the types of attacks that we're seeing. So that becomes a very significant challenge, especially for the U.S., for the pendulum services that have gone between, say, Asia, the Indian subcontinent, and the U.S. East Coast as an alternative to the Panama Canal or to Trans-Pacific services into the West Coast. Obviously, that has repercussions as well for supply chain managers trying to determine how they design their supply chains in terms of what routes they're going to depend on as they look into 2024. So that, combined with the Panama Canal, provides tremendous impetus to where we believe, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more, that the West Coast ends up benefiting.
What's happening both at the Suez and the Panama Canal, just another reminder again, Paul, of how disruption at one point in the supply chain, it impacts the global supply chain because there are a finite number of different alternatives. And so when you have two waterways, major waterways that are impacted, that cargo has to find a way to make its way to its destination. So let me get into another topic, right? We can't talk about global trade without talking about geopolitics and its impact on the global supply chain. Many shippers have shifted in recent years to a China plus one strategy. Where do you see growth in the plus one category specifically, and who do you see as the main winners?
Well, we don't believe that there will be a single substitute country. There will never again be sort of a single country like China dominating global supply chains on the goods production side, the factory floor for the world, or whatever people want to call it. Instead, it will be a regionalization of trade with some dominant patterns emerging for certain types of industries. India is one example of a country with great potential for the future, but by no means the only one. We believe a substantial amount of trade has and already will continue to shift into other parts of Asia, which will still depend on trans-Pacific trade for trade with the United States, as well as we're seeing shifts into countries like Mexico that have not anywhere near the population or the capacity of China, but have the proximity advantage to the United States. And for other regions of the world, such as Europe, they may depend and rely upon more on Central and Eastern Europe than they have on Asia for some of their supply chain developments in the future.
Well, I think what you just said is illustrative of what many shippers are doing, their strategy of diversifying the risk, right? Trying to spread that risk across and not be overly dependent on one market. So this brings us to another topic. There have been a number of buzzwords that have emerged. They're not necessarily new, but they've resurfaced in recent years. Is nearshoring and friendshoring finally turning into a trend? And what do you think this means for the U.S. market, especially here on the U.S. West Coast?
Well, there's no question that, however we want to call it, friendshoring, nearshoring, ally shoring has also been used, sort of this X-shoring category of shifting your supply chains to looking at country risk, not just looking at purely your cost of production in a foreign country. Taking those into account more substantially is likely to be the future of supply chain risk management. That benefits countries like Mexico, but it also benefits friendly democracies in other regions, such as in Asia, in terms of who we will be doing business with. It doesn't mean companies are going to abandon China. Like you said, it becomes a China plus one strategy where they still want to serve that very substantial end market, especially on the U.S. export side. But as far as putting your supply chain at risk, depending upon a single source country, those days are probably over. And that can extend to even the nearshoring, but there are definitely benefits in nearshoring in terms of reducing your supply chain risk by shortening those supply chains. However, we also understand there's some complexity to that, which may mean that there are components that go into factories for final consumption in a country like Mexico, but still depend on international ocean trade for some portion of the inputs that feed into that, what's so-called near sourcing of commodities, and yet the supply chain remains truly global, not truly bilateral between everything that goes into that production being between, say, two countries, whether that would be Mexico and the U.S. or Canada or Korea or whatever the other country would be.
As a matter of fact, when you look at all the cargo volumes that come in through our port here in Southern California, a percentage of that ends up in Mexico, used for manufacturing. Another growing trend that we've made notice of is e-commerce. A lot of e-commerce product is being repositioned to south of the border in Mexico, comes in through the San Pedro Bay Ports complex. But today, what are some of the other mega trends that you see emerging in the years ahead in response to all of this diversification?
Well, if we look at the bigger picture, the one that we can't get around, besides the geopolitics issue, which we've already talked about, is the energy transition. It's the movement globally away from fossil fuels and reduction in carbon emissions, whether it's from the transport side or stationary sources of emissions production, trying to fight global warming and climate change over time. It's pervasive in places like Europe already. It's advancing through international ongoing discussions across industries, across countries, and sort of on an unrelenting basis, including advances of technology, advances of capital investment, financial flows, many different aspects to that, all of which are going to affect businesses in ways that will increasingly be important. Some of it's on the regulatory side. Some of it comes from the customer demand side, where your supply chain partner wants to see the carbon footprint of your operations, and that is going to affect decision-making in terms of supply chain choice, including down to the level of carriers and facilities that the shippers and their supply chains depend upon.
You know, Paul, here in Long Beach, in Southern California, really, we are ground zero for that transition.
That's right.
We're doing everything decision or what happened at COP28 just a few weeks ago. And that transition is vital, right? And we can't afford to get it wrong. We have to get it right, and we don't have time on our side.
Right.
So agree 100%, and that's the reason why much of our focus here in Long Beach is on that transition, making sure that we're preparing the industry for that eventual quest to zero, right, which is ongoing. So this brings us to sort of the heart of our conversation today. As I mentioned earlier in our intro, this is our end of year episode where we've recapped 2023, and you've done an amazing job, as you normally do, in offering your insight and observations. But now we want to look ahead.
Right.
So what is your market outlook for 2024, and what do you view as the biggest risks and the biggest opportunities?
All right, well, let's start with the biggest picture, which is a global economy that's slowing a little bit from where we were in 2023. We're forecasting that these interest rate policies that have been pursued by central banks to fight inflation are having some success, but they haven't worked through the system yet entirely, and inflation hasn't fully been conquered. We're not down in the United States to the target level from the central bank, and they've made it very clear that at least may not be raising in 2024 than we saw in 2023, even though we saw in the United States the third quarter actually the strongest quarter of growth for the economy for the year. We believe actually that's not going to be sustainable, and we're going to see growth, GDP growth now forecast of 1.5% for 2024 compared to 2.3%, which is what we're forecasting we'll see by the end of this month. And if we look particularly at what's going to happen with consumption and trade, there's some reasons to believe that the goods consumption side, tied to international trade, will do a little bit better. In fact, from an import side, we're actually forecasting a reversal of the decline that we saw for all of 2023, where it declined substantially in the first part of the year and has started to come back in the second half of the year, such that it's going to continue with growth a little bit over 2% on imports for 2024. On the export side, we did have a positive 2023, and we're actually anticipating that that will continue into 2024, but still at a relatively moderate pace. And partly that's tied to the economic health of our trade partners. It's not only what happens within the United States. Some of the weakness in manufacturing we've seen in the United States is not tied only to that interest rate and cost of capital. It's also been weakness in some of our trade partner country economies that supply some of the demand for our economic activity. We're also seeing some reductions in some of the government stimulus still playing out. We had the big infrastructure bill that's been played out with higher levels of construction. We had some specific programs to bolster green manufacturing and some of the other sectors like semiconductor chips that played out into construction spending and manufacturing this year. That's not going to be repeated at the same level in 2024, but there'll be some other things that will help offset that. As we get to the end of 2024, we believe the economy will be strengthening and the trade will continue to grow as we come out of the year.
Well, there you have it, folks. You heard it first here on Supply Chain Insight. Paul's market outlook for 2024. That was fantastic, Paul. And again, the way that you present this in a very comprehensive way really connects a lot of dots, right? Because when you talk about global trade, you can't ignore the transition, right, to renewables. You can't ignore the geopolitics. So I love the way that you were able to roll it all together. So what advice, in light of what you just told us, your outlook for 2024 and beyond, what advice do you have for shippers heading into the new year?
Well, the first advice would be to resist some of the cost-driven temptations to revert to a just-in-time supply chain management, where you reduce the number of suppliers, narrow and try to lean out your supply chain to minimize costs, increasing your risk and vulnerability to disruptions. I mean, if what has happened in the last few months aren't evidence enough that, clearly the investment, which is really paying for insurance for your business to have a resilient system, is really required, and that the arguments up to the C-suite, the management chain, has to be to defend the investments that were being pursued in terms of resilience during the pandemic. Those really have to be continued. And in the face of cost pressures that are relentless, when trying to have inflation come down, it requires some price pressure on everybody that's trying to cover their increased costs, and that includes on the labor side. And yet, trying to build for resilience is critical in the face of the pressures that everybody can see, and we've hopefully learned some lessons through the pandemic, that if you don't do that, your company's going to suffer. You personally may suffer in terms of your job health if you're not adequately prepared.
Yeah, you know, picking up on that phrase, just in time, the last 3 years, we went through a series, right? We went from just-in-time logistics to just late to just in case, and that's where all the overordering. So it sounds like we're not quite back in the just-in-time mode, and resisting that temptation is going to be critical.
Yeah, it's got to continue. I mean, we've seen a big drawdown in inventories, and the risk is an overshoot, that you get to the point where you make yourself too vulnerable again to further disruptions, and then start to have some of the repeat of the problems, which we don't ever want to live through again, of congestion, some of the inability to handle demand changes like we saw during the pandemic.
Well, Paul, we've covered a lot just in the time that we've spent in this conversation. Is there anything else that we haven't covered, or anything else you want to leave our viewing audience with?
I would like to invite you to pick up this discussion again in a few months at TPM. Right here in Long Beach, our company hosts with the host port of Long Beach, TPM, and we hope all of the audience can join us for further discussions and much more elaboration on this in March of 2024.
Well said, Paul, and certainly I join you and the entire Port of Long Beach team in welcoming all of you to Long Beach for TPM 24. Well, Paul, thanks again for joining me on Supply Chain Insight. Your perspective and observations were extremely helpful as usual. To our valued audience, thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you again soon for another episode of Supply Chain Insight, brought to you by the Port of Choice, the Port of Long Beach.